Welcome to Omni-Biotic's educational webinar series. Today, we will be learning about rational probiotic selection made simple. I am Dr. Michelle Maddox, and I'm happy to be your speaker for this educational webinar. Let's look briefly at the topics that we'll be covering in today's webinar. We will do a brief definition review. We'll look at the US probiotic landscape, what makes a quality probiotic, some clinical targets for probiotics, and then how to put all of that together to make an informed decision. In the interest of clarity, let's review a few basic definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. So this particular graphic is really nice. It gives a good visual as you move across the different pictures. The first one is the microbiota. This is the organisms themselves. The middle picture, this is the metagenome. These are the genes and the genomes of the population. And this is including the bug and the host. And genome just means the sum total of an organism's DNA. The last picture that we're looking at here is the microbiome. And the microbiome is the gene, the genomes, and the products of the population, both the bug and the host. This is where we're looking at the whole soup, not just the individual ingredients. This is looking beyond the bugs into what they're actually doing, which is really exciting. So before we get too deeply into our conversation today, let's make sure that we all understand what's meant by the word strain. For some of you, this slide is going to be a review. You may be bored. For that, I apologize. For the rest of us, let's take a minute to go back to biology. Most of us learned some version of what is pictured here. Kings play chess on fine-grained sand. This is kingdom, phyla, class, family, genus, and species. You'll notice that within this taxonomy, there is no strain mentioned. So what is a strain? It is isolated from a species, and it's distinguished by genotypic and or phenotypic characteristics. Specific strains are then tested for targeted outcomes. There's so much talk currently about probiotics. Let's take a moment to look at consumer demand. After all, most of us are fundamentally in business. We have to feed ourselves and keep a roof over our heads, and therefore we need to figure out a way to make money. So the US probiotic landscape, the supplement sales in the US are a huge business. This is a graphic from 2019. In the next slide, we'll look at 2020 and 2021. Of the $8.8 billion, roughly 27% of it went to pre and probiotics. You can see that in that pie chart. And the second graphic on this slide, we can see that practitioner supplement sales are actually forecasted to go down. Currently, this accounts for only 7% of sales in this arena. So most of us are wondering, how do we get this up? Because supplement sales make up a large part of our revenue streams. I think it's an interesting dilemma. We have to price ourselves competitively from a supplement perspective. We are competing with the Amazons of the world, but we also have to help our clients and our patients understand why our supplements are different, that a higher quality supplement leads to a higher quality and targeted outcome. And we also have to make sure that we provide them with multiple buying options that are very easy through a portal, through a website, as well as in person. And then the other part of it is we have to let them know that we exist. We are not in the industry of if you build it, they will come. We need to advertise and let them know that we're here and why we are awesome, amazing, and unique. So looking at the landscape for growth in 2020 and 2021, we've seen an amazing growth in supplement sales, primarily due to pandemic, but what we see here is that a large part of that was in e-commerce forums. Again, not surprising given the pandemic. However, even as things have started to open back up to in person, we are still seeing that revenue increase, that online e-commerce revenue. So if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen, we see that probiotics are leading in revenue growth. There are an interesting collection of other supplements that are also growing quite a bit. And what we see here, obviously probiotics are the number one from a year-over-year revenue growth. This is looking at the health of the microbiome and our increasing our resilience and immune response and those types of things. Multivitamin and minerals, this is again related to our general health. Collagen, we have to remember that we are a part of an aging population. And so the fact that collagen is number 3 on this list is really interesting. I also think it speaks a little bit to the fact that people had a more conscious effort to move more during the pandemic because they were stuck at home. And collagen is known to help with the repair and the prevention of exercise-related injuries. We see the omegas were also on this particular category. And again, this is immune function, general health, inflammation. It's also healthy aging and brain function. And then vitamin D, which you could not watch the news, read a newspaper, look at a magazine article, go on any social media platform without seeing how important vitamin D was in the last couple of years. So it's very not surprising to see it here. As I mentioned before, we do not see this e-commerce trend declining. In fact, it's projected to increase. So as practitioners, we want to make sure that we are positioned to take advantage of this move to e-commerce for supplements. Let's take a minute to dive into the number 1 revenue increasing supplement over the last couple of years, probiotics. Specifically, let's focus on what makes a quality probiotic and how to tell if what you're using is one. So first and foremost, let's make sure that we know what a probiotic is. The definition of a probiotic is live microorganisms that, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. You will notice that this graphic on this page starts with strain, and that strain has been characterized. We'll dive into that here in just a second. Other things that are criteria here is that it has to be safe for consumption. There is a focus on at least 1 positive human study. And shelf life and stability has to be studied and established on the dosage that has shown to be effective. So let's look a bit into the strain significance and what do we mean by characterization? Characterization is simply something has been ID'd based on a biological, physiologic, or molecular characteristic. And so typically speaking, most of these things are being done via 16S RNA, which is also known as PCR, or through a whole genome shotgun. And characterization tells us things like what environments the microbe will survive in. It tells us if they will be positively impactful on inflammation, lipid modulation, immune cell modulation. Will this particular strain have the ability to directly kill or inhibit colonization of other microbes? And what specific products are these strains creating? And is that something that we want? It's impossible to extrapolate the characteristics of one strain to another strain, even if they come from the same species. In the canine world, we know that no 2 dogs are the same. This particular picture is one that I love. I used to have a Great Dane, and I can tell you that that particular dog is terrified of the teeny little Chihuahua there. In fact, that Chihuahua is probably growling at the Great Dane. And while they are both dogs, their personalities and characteristics, how they behave and what they do are vastly different. It's the same with probiotics. By definition, strains have unique genotypic and or phenotypic characteristics. Therefore, we cannot know that two different strains have similar actions without studying them. It's impossible to extrapolate the benefit or the lack of a benefit across different strains. So when you're looking at research articles, the specific strain used needs to be listed. Stopping at the species level is inadequate. If the paper doesn't specify the strain, the clinical application is unknown. And therefore, how do you know that you're going to get the same results when you try to use a product? Let's look at a specific example of different strains. So Lactobacillus casei. So L-casei W56 has been shown to positively impact depressive mood. And Lactobacillus casei W72 has been shown to have a beneficial impact on the immune system and no impact on depressive mood. How the strains that make up a probiotic come together is also important. You cannot just put probiotics that have been shown to positively impact a specific symptom in a bottle and call it good. Some will compete with each other and actually kill or inhibit the action of others. Some combinations have additive or complementary or synergistic impacts. Studies looking at single strain supplementation versus multi-strain supplementation have consistently shown greater benefit from a multi-strain formulation. It's hypothesized that this is because of quorum sensing, which is cell-to-cell communication. And these are based on the production, secretion, and detection of small signaling molecules. This can be really helpful. Those strains work together and they have an additive or synergistic impact, or it can be really harmful. And the combination of strains actually trigger bacteriocins that inhibit or kill other microbes in the mix. The study referenced on this slide has some really, really interesting examples of this. So if you want to take a little detour and geek out for a little bit, I welcome you to pull that up. The actual product in the bottle needs to be tested to ensure that it achieves what the product claims it achieves. Again, you're just throwing single strains together is inadequate. You cannot guarantee outcomes without testing the formulation to assess if all the microbes survive and it gives the desired outcome. This is it's not the number of CFU, it's what you do with them that counts slide. And studies have evaluated strains and formulations ranging from 100 million CFUs to over 50 billion CFUs. And as a reminder, CFUs are colony forming units. And colony forming units, way back on that slide that talked about the specific examples of different strain impacts, those little dots that were on the slide, each of those is a colony forming unit. So factors that could impact efficacy, the strains are the strain synergies, as we've already said, whether a particular organism is acid resistant and able to survive in the GI. What is the probiotic matrix? Are there prebiotics or other things in that supplement that are actually feeding those bugs while they're in transit? What's the manufacturing process? What's their quality control look like? Obviously, individual genetics, physiology, all of those things are going to come into play when we're looking at how effective it is. And then the delivery methodology. So taking a moment to look at the challenge of stability, as with any supplement, we have to know under what conditions the quality is stable and what can negatively impact the quality of the product. Probiotics are alive, that's by definition, and therefore they may be impacted by a larger number of variables than other supplements. So things like heat or cold are obviously gastric secretions, exposure to air, and other things that are in the product. So ways to ensure you are getting what is promised. Stabilizers are used in the formulation. Typically, probiotics have other things in them. These are usually listed as those inactive ingredients. And for probiotics, it can be other microbes that help stabilize the mix, or it can be prebiotics so that those bugs are feeding off of things and staying alive while they're being delivered to you and your patient. What's the delivery method? Is it a capsule? Is it a powder? Is it a liquid? Is it a food product? And then how is it packaged? And is there protection from things known to harm or damage the product built into that packaging? In the industry, some probiotics will use a thing called overage. And the theory behind overage is that there's some level of die-off that's expected. And so they put more than the human clinical trials showed was effective in the product, thereby theoretically increasing the likelihood that what's on the shelf will be a viable product. I am a data person, so for me, I'm not really comfortable with that particular strategy. I like to see the studies that showed the numbers that I'm taking achieve the outcome that I'm wanting. And quality recognition is something that should be paid attention to. The world of supplements and probiotics have certifying bodies just like everything else. And this helps consumers and practitioners and wholesalers know that at least some level of compliance or quality control has been achieved by the company. And some specific to probiotics you should be looking for are shown on this slide. Awards won is something that you may want to pay attention to, but you have to ask yourself a few questions when you're looking at this. Why did they win the award? Was it because their clinical studies were scientifically sound and impressive, or was it because their packaging was easy to open? And which one of those do you care the most about? Do you care that they won the award that they did? If they won an award for a multivitamin and mineral, does that translate to them also having a quality probiotic? And then, do you care about the awarding body? Is it an awarding body who follows or is in line with your values, your beliefs, and your goals? Now that we've reviewed the basics of what we're looking for in a quality probiotic, let's talk about how we use them with our patients and clients. There are a myriad of reasons that we would want to use a probiotic. Let's do a high-level review of those. And then we'll also spend some time looking at examples of studies used to determine clinical applications. We will look at specific dosages used, the strains, and the outcomes, all of the things that we talked about having to pay attention to when we're looking for a quality probiotic. So first and foremost is the application of probiotics we are all very, very familiar with. This is the digestion and metabolism. We have all known about this for years, right? They are responsible for the degradation of insoluble dietary fibers as well as protein. They are responsible for fermentation, primary bile acid deconjugation to secondary bile acids. They assist with some vitamin synthesis, help with appetite regulation. They activate some of our medications. This is always the story that I tell to people. This is why when a woman is taking oral birth control pills and has to take an antibiotic, the pharmacist will always say to use a different form of birth control. Most birth control pills are formulated relying on the gut microbiome and the microbes within the gut activating that pill. If a person is on an antibiotic, it kills those microbes off, and therefore the birth control pill is not activated. And then obviously things like bowel regularity and gas and bloating. I'm not going to go into all the research for the digestion and metabolism application. There's a ton, as you can see here. This is really a very high level screenshot of total number of studies found, looking at both probiotic digestive health and probiotic metabolism, ranging all the way back to 1965. Any stool test that you look at, or at least any stool test worth its salt, will show you a diversity score. And this is incredibly important, especially as we age. Studies consistently show a healthy gut microbiome has a good degree of diversity. And as the diversity decreases, the health of the gut microbiome and the health of the host decreases. We know that microbial diversity decreases with age, as does the robustness of our immune system. And intestinal permeability tends to also increase with age. Inflammaging is a term that has gained in popularity recently. We know that inflammation increases as we age. The microbiome modulates the immune response and inflammation. So is it any surprise that these go awry as the diversity of our microbiome decreases? Let's look at inflammation a little more closely for a moment. So low-grade inflammation, or LGI, increases as we age. Studies looking at aging consistently show serum elevations and inflammatory markers in elderly. Let's pause for a moment and define elderly. There is a hot and very involved debate over what actually constitutes the term elderly. In general, those over 85 are in the long-lived category, with centenarians in the extreme longevity bucket. Late adults and elderly tend to be awarded that label around age 65. We see serum inflammatory markers typically elevated in this population. Those markers are things like interleukin-6, interleukin-1, TNF-alpha, CRP, and fibrinogen. There are many others that show as elevated in some elderly populations, and typically those are associated with populations that have specific conditions. The microbiome modulates our inflammatory response from a very early age, and some studies are now showing it begins in utero, actually, and it's not this, completely clean and sterile environment. So again, it's not surprising that as the microbiome shifts away from healthy, we as a person do as well. So let's dive into this gut immune axis. The gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or otherwise known as GALT. We know that roughly 70% of the human immune system resides in the gut. The main components of this system are the lamina propria, the mesenteric lymph nodes, intraepithelial lymph nodes, and lymphoid follicles, which include things like Peyer's patches. The mucus layer, which is the first line of defense in the GI, this is produced by goblet cells, and it's a physical barrier to prevent host microbiota contact and translocation. A huge part of our immune system exists to regulate microbe and host interaction. Then we have our epithelial cells. These produce antimicrobial peptides, or otherwise known as AMPs. These are things like antidefensins and Reg3 gamma. This is referred to as the demilitarized zone. IgA, specific for commensals, is produced with the help of dendritic cells. Remember, these are our antigen-presenting and phagocytic cells. This interacts with B and T cells in our Peyer's patches, and it produces commensal-derived antigens based on microbiota sampling. I always think about this as like little kids and even animals, especially dogs, will do this. They go play, right? And they pick up something off the ground and they come back and they show it to mom and they're like, look, what's this? And mom reacts with, oh, I don't know, let's investigate. Or, that's cool, it's this and it's no big deal. Or, oh my gosh, put that down. And IgA is really doing the same thing. It sends these little feelers out into the lumen of the gut, sample the bugs that are back there, bring them back to the immune system. And it's like, hey, what's this? Are we okay with this? And it really is like that little kid or that dog going, hey, look what I found. We also have short chain fatty acids. These are produced by bacteria fermentation of indigestible carbohydrates, otherwise known as fiber. They create a hostile environment by lowering the pH. They have the ability to actually lower the virulence gene expression in the microbes themselves. And especially butyrate, which is one of these short chain fatty acids, it can regulate the size and function of the regulatory T cell network. We have the FOXP3 Treg cells. These suppress cells like NF-kappa beta. They maintain peripheral and mucosal homeostasis by sensing microbial products and metabolites. Disruption of this homeostasis results in a loss of oral tolerance and development of abnormal immune responses in the gut. And we have production of bacteriocins. These are short, toxic peptides produced by specific bacteria to inhibit colonization and growth of other species. Bile acids have antimicrobial properties as well. The conjugated primary bile acids are deconjugated to secondary bile acids in the colon, things like deoxycholic and lithocholic acids. And these can be highly toxic to certain bacteria, specifically things like Staph aureus and C. diff. Let's take a moment to look at a specific study using Omni-Biotic AB10. And this particular study is looking at repopulation after antibiotics and prevention of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. The patients in this particular study were given freeze-dried probiotic powder containing 5 billion CFU, and they were given this twice per day. They were in a geriatric long-term care facility, and it was targeting the reduction of AAD. What was found is a significant drop in AAD among those receiving probiotics. There were no adverse events. Interestingly, the staff had a very positive perception of probiotics, primarily based on the fact that they were prescribed. In another study using Omni-Biotic AB10, this was the same formulation. It is 5 billion CFUs. And this was used in a long-term care facility where 100% of patients were colonized with multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria. Samples were taken of stool and in the inguinal folds. They found the number of patients who had this multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria was down to 75% from 100% by 8 weeks into the treatment protocol. At 24 weeks, which was 12 weeks after the probiotic was discontinued, that result was still seen. And you can see on this chart that by week 20, the 100% of patients colonized dropped to 42% of patients colonized. And that held through week 24. At week 36, there was a little bit of a pop back up, but even at that, it only popped to 67%, which is still statistically significant below 100% of patients. The only thing that was done was this probiotic. They did not do any dietary or lifestyle or hygiene interventions. Let's look now at the gut-skin axis. So vitamin D, studies show that there's a potential signaling pathway between the microbiome and the skin via this vitamin D pathway. And we know that probiotics can increase serum vitamin D levels in patients with a gut microbiome imbalance. The large majority of skin issues, things like atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, acne vulgaris, rosacea, etc., occur in patients who also have gut dysbiosis or a gut microbial imbalance. The hypothesis for this link include the LPS pathway, which tends to be upregulated in these patients. And short-chain fatty acids imbalance are driven by a balance in gut microbiome and or fiber for microbes to use to create short-chain fatty acids. The microbiome induces IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, and IGF-1 promotes proliferation of sebocytes and keratinocytes, as well as inducing lipid synthesis in the sebaceous gland. We know also that epidermal function interactions are driven by free phenol and paracresol, which are metabolites seen after a C. diff infection, and they can disrupt the epidermal barrier integrity by reducing the expression of keratin 10 in keratinocytes. Lowering these phenol levels has been shown to decrease skin sensitivity and improve epidermal barrier functions. Studies lowered phenol levels by giving probiotics. Let's take a moment to look at a study done on Omni-Biotic product Panda. This particular study is targeting the offspring of women who are more prone to atopic diseases, and eczema being one of those. So a study done, they used a freeze-dried probiotic powder. It was given to the moms the last 6 weeks of pregnancy and continued in the babies for 12 months. This particular probiotic powder had 3 billion CFUs of a multi-strain probiotic. Patients were followed for the first 2 years of life. So the babies were followed. And the study assessed the development of eczema during the first 2 years and the initial impact on early microbial colonization and immune responses. What was found in this study is that 58% relative risk reduction of parental reported eczema, and that was sustained over 2 years, despite the fact that the probiotic was stopped in the first year of life. There was also a reduced Th2 cytokine, so interleukin 5 and interleukin 13, hypothesis being that this particular probiotic blend helps flip that Th1, Th2 balance. We care about this because in atopic diseases, we see a preponderance of Th2 and a lower number of Th1. Let's take a moment to look at the gut-liver axis. Our primary bile acids are conjugated to secondary bile acids by bacteria in the gut. The receptors FXR, which is the farnesoid X receptor, and TGR5, the Takeda G protein coupled receptor 5, are activated by bile acids. These receptors are responsible for glucose and lipid metabolism, among other things. The intestinal permeability is up and down regulated by bile acid, AMPs, which are those antimicrobial peptides, acetaldehyde, LPS, TMA, etc. Increased intestinal permeability allows translocations of things not supposed to leave the intestines. Things like PAMPs, which are pathogen-associated molecular patterns, DAMPs, damage-associated molecular patterns, and these patterns are recognized by Kupffer and hepatic stellate cells. They trigger inflammation and have been strongly linked to liver fibrosis. We also know that xenobiotics and steroid hormones are conjugated and packaged for excretion in the feces. Bacteria in the gut produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase that deconjugate these products. They freeze them up for recirculation and reabsorption. And then short chain fatty acids, these just keep coming up. They are highly important and they're produced by gut microbes acting on resistant starch or fiber. These short chain fatty acids, especially butyrate, are key for maintaining a healthy GI barrier. Gut microbiome imbalance throws off this particular balance and facilitates barrier weakening, otherwise known as leaky gut. And it's again allowing translocation of PAMPs and DAMPs, which are increasingly being shown to harm the liver. So a quick nutshell of that is that the gut-liver axis looks like TMAO, LPS, acetaldehyde, etc., bile acids, both primary and secondary, are released based on feedback from the microbiome products in the GI. This feedback loop helps control how permeable the GI is, the amount of bile acids produced, the types of secondary products like short chain fatty acids, long chain fatty acids, etc. And the types of bugs in our gut dictate the additional products created, the LPS and the TMEA and the TMAO, which are the things that trigger the whole process in the first place. Let's take a moment to look at a study using Omni-Biotic Hetox, a product specifically targeting liver detoxification and detoxification in general. In this particular study, patients with type 2 diabetes, hemoglobin A1C over 7%, and they had neuropathy. They were on no other treatments at all. And they were given 15 billion CFU freeze-dried powder for 6 months and literally no other interventions, no diet, lifestyle, movement, nothing. And what is seen is actually really impressive given that it was a monotherapy. The study showed results that are a decrease in glucose, insulin, and thereby a decrease in HOMA-IR. The lipids were improved, both the cholesterol to HDL ratio as well as total cholesterol. There was a reduction in TNF alpha, interleukin 6, CRP, and resistin, and there was a decrease in leptin and an increase in adiponectin. And this is really interesting. We know that along with type 2 diabetes, we often have this thing called leptin resistance. And what we see usually is an increase in leptin and low adiponectin. Remember, leptin is long-term energy and storage. It's our satiety hormone, and it should be low when we are hungry and high when we're in well-fed or high-fat stores. Whereas adiponectin, it increases our insulin sensitivity and it's highly anti-inflammatory. And then resistin, which I always kind of think as resistance to insulin, it is strongly linked to obesity and type 2 diabetes, inflammation, lipid imbalance, and a host of other things. So the fact that this monotherapy of a multi-strain probiotic actually impacted resistin and the lipid-adiponectin ratio is really very encouraging. Next, let's look at the gut-brain axis. I am a highly visual person, and these particular graphics are really helpful for me. So there is a bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain via the vagus nerve. Neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine can be directly produced by gut microbes. Their metabolism is also heavily influenced by microbes. The serotonin precursor tryptophan is driven away from serotonin and down the kynurenine pathway by bacteria. One of the ways this happens is via LPS, which is produced by bacterial endotoxins. And this LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, stimulates tryptophan to go down the kynurenine pathway. The kynurenine pathway is inflammatory and can lead to things like quinolinic acid, which has been implicated in a number of hormone-mediated cancers. And the other part of this is that now you're funneling away from this serotonin and melatonin pathway. Short chain fatty acids can directly stimulate the sympathetic fight or flight pathway, and stress causes an increase in cortisol, which can lead to increased GI permeability and increased inflammation. Let's take a moment to look at a study on Omni-Biotic's award-winning stress release, which is a psychobiotic. There are a number of studies showing psychobiotics benefits in depression. In this particular pilot study, patients were given multi-strain freeze-dried powder probiotic of 7.5 billion CFUs for 4 weeks and no other intervention. I really like this study because it uses both subjective, which is the PANAS questionnaire, as well as objective fMRI findings. The PANAS questionnaire, it's a widely accepted questionnaire. And by questionnaires, we're attempting to objectify something that is inherently subjective. However, it is technically still a subjective finding. What the PANAS showed was that there was significantly more positive affect and a reduction of hopelessness and risk aversion. And think about things like, sitting at home and they want to interact with others, et cetera. That's that type of a risk aversion that we're talking about here. The fMRI of these particular individuals showed an increase in the functional connectivity in the salience network. This is the network that is responsible for attention, perception, and cognition, and a decreased functional connectivity in the default mode network. And this is the network that's responsible for distraction, rumination, and impaired reasoning and decision making. I had the pleasure of speaking with someone who was at the college that did this particular study. And I told her I cringe when I think about risk reduction because I have 2 young boys and that's the last thing that I want. She chuckled and said, really, this is the patient population who is afraid to speak to people if they're in a social setting because they're afraid of how they're going to be judged, or they are the patient population who's sitting at home and they're really lost in their own internal world and they're ruminating in their own brain. They're kind of stuck there. And something so simple as a probiotic for 4 weeks was able to actually improve that. And that's a pretty darn powerful tool as a foundation for a treatment protocol. We've covered quite a bit of information about what makes a quality probiotic, as well as a brief review of literature focusing on all the different ways the gut is connected to inflammation, aging, skin, brain, liver, etc. So let's do a focused review to help you when you're next picking a probiotic. What is your decision checklist? So let's start with the basics. The product should have strains listed, right? You want a strain product and you want multiple strains. The strains in the probiotic should have studies showing they are safe and effective. You will need to do a little bit of literature searching here. Do not rely 100% on the company. You need to be a savvy consumer and advocate for your patients and your clients. The entire probiotic formulation should have studies showing efficacy, preferably in humans. And the organisms in the probiotic will interact with each other, not just the host. It's that synergy thing. So we need to see that the product that's in the bottle we want to give one of our clients or patients is actually going to do what it says it's going to do. The probiotics need to survive their journey to the shelf and through the GI and have metabolic activity. The manufacturer should have studies showing survivability of the specific formulation you are thinking about using. Any company you're purchasing from for your patient should be able to point you to the studies that were done using their products. These companies have spent a lot of time and money on these studies. They are literally waiting for you to ask them for them. So send them an email, call them and ask. If they don't jump right on, sure, I'll get that right over to you, and then they do it, you might want to consider moving on to a different company who will provide those studies for you, who has done that level of checking on their products. I'm a big fan of making sure that at the end of a presentation, we circle back to what it is that we should have taken away from this particular presentation. So let's look at these key takeaways. Number one, it's all about the strains. If there are no strains listed, put it back on the shelf, the virtual or otherwise shelf. The strains allow you to select a probiotic that is targeted and can facilitate consistent outcomes. Number two, research on the product is non-negotiable and non-transferable. What is true for one strain is not necessarily true for another, and how strains work together varies. Even small pilot or case studies are good for you to see this information. Obviously, we all have our own individual threshold for evidence. Number three, it's not the CFU, it's what you do with them. All the studies showcased today used between 3 and 15 billion CFU products. I would say those studies showed a significant amount of efficacy of the product for the specific and targeted outcomes. And 4, it really does start in the gut. We've discussed many intersections of the gut and various other systems and disease processes within the body. The microbiome has incredible influence over our entire being, from our mental and emotional health to how well our body detoxifies substances and how we age. It is easy to see why a high-quality, multi-strain, targeted probiotic should be at the base of our treatment pyramids. Thank you so much for joining me today for this Omni-Biotic educational webinar. Have a wonderful day.